On the outskirts of a forgotten town, beneath a sky heavy with rain, veteran Ethan Cole thought his wars were long behind him. But that night, as he pulled his truck to the side of a deserted road, he heard it, a faint, broken whimper coming from a torn black trash bag half buried in the mud. Inside wasn't garbage. It was a German shepherd, bruised, starving, and trembling from fear. Ethan tore the bag open and froze. In those shattered eyes, he saw the same pain he'd once carried home from battle. Without a word, he lifted the dog into his arms, unaware that this single act of mercy would drag him into a darker war, one of greed, cruelty, and secrets buried beneath his own town. A soldier scarred by war, a dog abandoned by the world, and a bond that would prove sometimes the truest battles are fought with compassion, not bullets. The wind of Ravenfield carried a metallic howl that stripped the warmth from bone. It swept across the rusted carcasses of old cars and refrigerators, turning the town's landfill into a field of restless ghosts. The sky hung low and bruised, the light fading to a dull amber haze. Somewhere in that wasteland, the engine of an old Ford pickup coughed and died, leaving behind only the hum of the wind and the slow ticking of metal cooling in the cold. Ethan Cole sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed on nothing, hands resting heavy on the steering wheel. He was 42, broad-shouldered, a man whose posture betrayed the discipline of years in uniform. His face was lean and weathered, marked by small scars that caught the light like pale threads. A faint one ran down from his left cheekbone to his jaw. An old memory from Kandahar. His short-cropped hair showed streaks of gray, and his week-old beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled. Ethan was the kind of man who carried silence like armor. After 2 tours overseas and too many nights in a hospital bed, he had traded war for isolation, buying a cheap cabin on the edge of a dying town called Ravenfield. The factory had closed a decade ago, leaving behind rows of empty houses and men who had forgotten how to dream. Ethan stayed because he didn't know where else to go. He had told the guys at the Veterans Hall he wouldn't make it to the reunion tonight, said he needed space. But truthfully, he just couldn't stand the sound of laughter that didn't belong to him. He opened the truck door and stepped out. The air bit hard, carrying the smell of oil, ash, and damp earth. Beneath his boots, the ground was slick with mud and shards of broken glass. Around him sprawled the landfill, an ocean of junk and regret. An old washing machine lay on its side like a tombstone. Plastic bags fluttered from broken branches like torn flags. The wind pressed against him, but he didn't move. It was almost peaceful here, in a way only forgotten places could be. Then he heard it, a sound too soft to be the wind. He froze. A faint whimper drifted through the air, weak and sharp, like a breath caught in pain. His body reacted before thought. Muscles tightened, ears tuned. The sound came again, from somewhere near a heap of twisted metal. He started walking. Near the edge of the pile stood a man, thin and sharp-boned, wearing a torn denim jacket. His face was pale and narrow, eyes sunken and restless, skin gray under the dim sky. A cigarette dangled from his lip as he dragged a large black trash bag, grunting with effort. The bag was heavy, shifting slightly every few seconds. Ethan called out, "Hey, you need a hand?" The man flinched and turned, voice rough. "Mind your own business." Ethan's tone stayed calm. "What's in the bag?" "Garbage," the man spat, but then the bag jerked. The movement was subtle, yet unmistakably alive. Ethan stepped closer. "Garbage doesn't move." The man's shoulders tensed. "It's sick," he said quickly. "Not worth saving." He dropped the bag and stepped back. "You want it? It's yours." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and disappeared into the fog. Ethan crouched down. The bag was tied with yellow cord, slick with mud. Inside, something whimpered again. Short, broken breaths, fading fast. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket and cut the knot. The plastic split open, and from the dark spilled a German shepherd, young but starved nearly to death. The dog's fur, once a deep sable, was patchy and dull. His ribs pushed against his skin. One ear was torn, and a front paw was crudely wrapped in duct tape. His eyes, one golden and one clouded with injury, stared at Ethan with the terror of something that had been taught not to hope. The sight hit Ethan like a memory. He had seen that look before, in soldiers bleeding out on the sand, in children huddled beneath collapsed walls. He swallowed, forcing his voice to steady. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "You're all right now." The dog trembled but didn't move. His breathing was shallow, a rasp of fear and exhaustion. Ethan slowly extended his hand, palm up. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog sniffed weakly, his lips twitching, but no growl came. "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "I get it. You don't trust anyone." He cut away the rest of the tangled plastic and slid his arm under the animal's chest. The shepherd's body was light, almost weightless, his warmth fading fast. Ethan lifted him gently. The smell of wet fur and blood filled the air, sharp and human in its honesty. As he carried the dog to the truck, the wind howled around them, kicking dust and paper into the air. Ethan opened the passenger door, laid his worn leather jacket on the seat, and set the shepherd down. "You're not garbage," he said softly. The dog blinked at him, confusion flickering behind exhaustion. Ethan climbed in, turned the key. The old engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. Headlights sliced through the fog as the truck rolled forward. The rain began, a fine mist that turned to steady drops, drumming on the roof like fingers. Ethan looked over. The shepherd had slumped sideways, eyes half closed, breathing uneven but alive. "You need a name," Ethan said quietly, voice more to himself than to the dog. "Can't just call you Kid." He thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "How about Ranger? You look like one." The shepherd's tail moved once, weak but deliberate. Ethan exhaled, a small laugh lost in the sound of the storm. "All right, Ranger it is." As the truck wound through the wet road toward the distant lights of Ravenfield, Ethan kept one eye on the road and one on the silent figure beside him. He didn't know what kind of world had broken the dog, or why it had chosen him to find it, but he understood one thing. Saving Ranger might not fix what war had done to him, but it gave him something the silence never could. Purpose. The rain grew heavier, the wipers squeaking against the glass, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the faint pulse of life stirring inside the quiet. He glanced again at the shepherd, whose chest rose and fell in fragile rhythm, and whispered, "You're safe now. Under my watch, no one gets left behind." The headlights cut through the darkness, the road curving into the night, carrying two wounded souls away from the landfill and toward a story neither yet knew they were beginning. By the time Ethan reached the edge of Ravenfield, the storm had thickened into a restless drizzle, the kind that didn't pour but lingered, soaking everything in quiet persistence. His cabin stood alone at the end of a dirt road, half hidden behind a line of leafless birch trees. The paint had long faded from white to gray, and one of the porch steps creaked so loud that even the wind paused to listen. The house was small but sturdy, a veteran's kind of place. Everything inside had a purpose, nothing more, nothing less. The faint smell of cedar and old coffee hung in the air. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the weak body he carried. Ranger lay limp against his chest, eyes dull, ribs pressing against Ethan's jacket. The dog's breathing was shallow, uneven, a sound that made the silence in the room ache. Ethan set him down gently near the fireplace, then tossed a few logs into the hearth and struck a match. The fire hesitated, then caught, washing the room in amber light. "You're all right now," Ethan said softly. "We'll fix you up." As he was pulling the first aid box from a cabinet, a knock echoed through the door. A woman's voice followed, calm but firm. "Ethan, you home? I saw your truck." He hesitated before answering. "Yeah, come in, Maya." The door opened to reveal Maya Scott, his neighbor from 2 houses down the gravel road. She was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her face carried that quiet beauty that comes from resilience. High cheekbones, gentle lines around the mouth, and a kind of strength that doesn't need to be spoken. Her skin was fair but lightly freckled, and her eyes were deep hazel, holding the weight of both sorrow and stubbornness. She had been a nurse once, before the accident that took her husband 3 winters ago. Since then, she kept mostly to herself, spending her days tending her small garden and volunteering at the animal shelter in town. Maya stepped in, shaking off her raincoat. Her gaze fell on the dog by the fire, and the calm in her voice vanished. "Oh my God. Ethan, what happened?" "Found him in a landfill," Ethan replied, crouching beside Ranger. "Someone stuffed him in a bag, left him to die." Maya dropped to her knees next to the dog. "Jesus, who would—" She didn't finish the question. She didn't need to. Her hands, steady and sure, moved over the shepherd's body with a practiced gentleness. "He's dehydrated, starving too. And this leg—" She peeled back the tape slowly, revealing an angry wound where the skin had broken. "We'll need to clean this before it gets worse." Ethan fetched a basin of warm water and an old towel, while Maya unpacked a small kit from her bag. She carried antiseptic, gauze, even a small bottle of honey, a home remedy for infected wounds. As she worked, Ethan watched her fingers move. They were quick, efficient, but every so often she paused to whisper something to the dog, soft words like "good boy" and "hang in there." The dog didn't resist, only trembled as she dabbed the wound. Ethan knelt opposite her, holding Ranger's head steady. "You've done this before," he said quietly. "Too many times," she answered, eyes flickering. "People bring in dogs like this all the time. Some make it, most don't." When they finished, Maya covered the wound with clean gauze and wrapped it tightly. Ranger looked better already, still weak, but breathing easier. Maya sat back on her heels and sighed. "He's young, maybe 3. You saved him just in time." Ethan nodded but didn't reply. The fire crackled between them, filling the space with warmth that felt fragile but real. After a while, Maya stood, brushing dust off her jeans. "I'll check on him tomorrow. He'll need food, something soft to start." She looked at Ethan, her expression half stern, half amused. "And so will you, judging by that fridge of yours." He gave a faint smile. "Still not used to cooking, for one." "Then start learning," she said, grabbing her coat. "You've got another mouth to feed now." When she left, the cabin felt smaller, but not empty. The storm had calmed into a whisper, tapping gently against the window. Ethan sat down beside Ranger. The dog stirred, eyes half open, and gave a soft grunt before resting his head on his paws. "You're tough," Ethan murmured. "That's good. You'll need it." He reached over and placed a bowl of water near the dog's muzzle. Ranger sniffed it weakly before taking a few hesitant laps. For the first time that night, Ethan allowed himself to exhale. Hours passed. The fire sank into glowing embers. Ethan dozed off in his chair, boots still on, one hand resting near the dog's side. At some point, he was pulled from sleep by a sound, a soft whimper, followed by frantic breathing. Ranger's legs twitched, claws scraping against the wooden floor, his body jerked as if running through invisible smoke. Ethan sat up instantly. "Hey," he said gently. "It's okay." The dog whimpered again, eyes shut tight, caught in whatever nightmare haunted him. Ethan reached out, resting a hand on his back. "You're not there anymore. You're safe." Slowly, the trembling stopped. Ranger's breathing evened out, the tension melting from his frame. Ethan leaned back, staring into the dying fire. He knew that kind of sleep, the kind that dragged you back to the places you'd survived but never escaped. He'd had them too, nights when the sound of rain became artillery, and the crack of thunder was enough to make his chest seize. He used to wake up with his fists clenched, expecting to find blood on them. Now he watched the dog, realizing they shared the same kind of ghosts. "I've got you," he whispered, the words almost lost in the crackle of ash. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The world outside glowed, silver with mist. Ethan brewed coffee, its bitter scent filling the cabin. Ranger raised his head, blinking sleepily, and gave a small wag of his tail. A fragile movement, but enough to make Ethan smile. He poured warm water over a handful of oats, stirred in a bit of leftover broth, and slid the bowl toward the dog. "Breakfast for heroes," he said. Ranger sniffed, hesitated, then ate, slow and careful. Later, as the first light seeped through the windows, there was another knock. Maya stood there again, hair damp from fog, holding a bag of supplies, bandages, antibiotics, and a few cans of dog food. "Morning," she said. "I couldn't sleep thinking about him." Ethan stepped aside to let her in. "He's better," he said. "Thanks to you." She knelt beside the dog again, smiling softly. "Well, you've got yourself a fighter." Ranger looked up at her, then at Ethan, tail thumping once against the floor. "See?" Maya said. "He already knows you're his person." Ethan poured her a cup of coffee. For a while, they sat together in easy silence, the kind that needed no words. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the long road that cut through the trees. Maya glanced toward it and said quietly, "You did a good thing, Ethan. Not many people would stop for a sound in the dark." He stared into his cup. "Maybe I just couldn't stand walking away again." She nodded, as if she understood something he didn't have to say. "We all need saving from something," she said. When she left again, the day had turned pale and bright. Ethan stood by the window, watching her figure disappear down the road, the hem of her coat brushing the tall grass. Behind him, Ranger stretched and yawned, a soft, ordinary sound that filled the cabin with life. Ethan turned back, his voice steady but gentle. "You and me, Ranger. Looks like we've both got a lot to learn about being alive again." The dog blinked, ears flicking toward the sound of his name, and then he settled back down near the fire, content. That night, when the wind rose again and brushed against the old cabin walls, Ethan didn't feel the same crushing loneliness he'd known before. The house wasn't just a shelter anymore. It had become something living, something that breathed with the rhythm of two broken souls finding their way home. The morning came gray and muted, as if the world itself was still half asleep. A pale fog hung low across the trees, softening the lines of Ravenfield's dirt road and wrapping Ethan's cabin in a veil of silence. Inside, the fire from last night had died down to a nest of fading embers. Ethan sat at the wooden table, his coffee untouched, eyes following the slow rise and fall of Ranger's chest as the dog slept near the hearth. The wounds had started to close, but beneath the fur still lay a tension, a quiet readiness, like a soldier expecting orders that would never come. Every so often, Ranger twitched, and his paw would move as if recalling a drill buried deep in memory. Ethan recognized that restlessness. He'd lived with the same kind of ghosts. The sound of tires crunching gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Through the window, he saw a small blue SUV roll to a stop outside the gate. A woman stepped out, tall and composed, dressed in a tan coat that brushed her knees. She carried a leather medical bag and moved with the certainty of someone used to taking charge. Her hair was chestnut brown, streaked with silver, tied back in a neat twist, and her posture had the elegance of discipline. As she approached, Ethan noticed the resemblance to Maya, same sharp jawline, same calm authority, but her eyes were colder, analytical. When she knocked, he opened the door halfway. "You must be Ethan," she said. Her voice was low, professional, but not unkind. "I'm Helen Scott, Maya's sister. She said you might need a proper vet to look at your friend." Ethan stepped aside. "Come in. He's over here." Helen entered, her boots leaving faint prints on the wooden floor. She took in the cabin in one sweeping glance: the sparse furniture, the half-cleaned medical supplies, the faint smell of disinfectant, and then knelt beside the dog. "You did good work," she murmured, examining the bandages Maya had placed. "For someone without training." "She did most of it," Ethan replied. "I just held him together." Helen smiled faintly, then focused on Ranger. "Hey, boy," she said softly, running a hand along his side. "Let's see what secrets you're keeping." Her hands were steady, practiced, each movement deliberate. She lifted his ear, checked his gums, pressed lightly against his abdomen. Then she frowned. "May I take some blood? I want to run a quick test." Ethan nodded, watching as she drew a small vial from her kit. Ranger didn't flinch at the needle. He just stared at her with eyes that seemed older than his body. Helen took the sample to the counter and unpacked a portable analyzer, an advanced device that hummed quietly as it processed. "That's not something most small-town vets carry," Ethan remarked. Helen shrugged. "I work with the county animal rescue. They deal with all kinds of cases, sometimes the kind that don't make it to paper." Her tone carried an undercurrent he couldn't quite place. "Maya told me where you found him," she continued. "Landfill, right? Near the industrial zone?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Why?" "That area's been off-limits for years. Toxic runoff, abandoned warehouses, not a place people wander into by accident." The machine beeped. Helen leaned forward, her brow tightening as she studied the display. "What is it?" Ethan asked. She didn't answer right away, instead double-checking the results. When she finally looked up, her voice was quieter. "He's got residual traces of zetanol in his blood." Ethan frowned. "What's that?" "A cheap sedative, illegal in most states now. Used to suppress aggression in trained canines during transport. You'd only find it in outdated military or police programs." She paused, eyes narrowing. "There's more. See this pattern?" She turned the device toward him. Small puncture scars along the shoulder and thigh. Consistent spacing. That's injection work, routine dosing. He's been under chemical control before. Ethan's stomach sank. "You're saying he was military?" "Or something close to it," Helen said, "but not a normal K9 unit. I've seen dogs from law enforcement, border patrol, even combat service. None of them showed this combination of markers." She hesitated, as though weighing how much to tell him. "About 5 years ago, there was a federal contract, classified Canine Behavioral Enhancement Program. They called it Project Sentinel. It was meant to create high-response dogs for covert operations, tracking, explosives, even biorecognition. The program collapsed after a scandal. Abuse, overconditioning, disappearances. Officially, all dogs involved were decommissioned. Ethan's jaw tightened. Decommissioned, he repeated, the word tasting bitter. You mean destroyed? Helen nodded slowly. That's the rumor. If Ranger came from that program, then someone's already broken the law just by letting him live. The room fell silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire. Ethan looked at the dog, now sleeping fitfully, his paws twitching as if running through the shadows of old commands. He flinches at loud sounds, Ethan said quietly. Sometimes he growls in his sleep, like he's still waiting for orders. Helen straightened, closing her medical bag. Then he remembers more than they wanted him to, and if that's true, he's dangerous, not because of what he'll do, but because of what he knows. Ethan met her gaze. You think someone will come for him? If he's the last of that program? Absolutely. There are people who'd rather erase evidence than face accountability. You might have picked up more trouble than you realize. The fire popped sharply, sending a burst of sparks into the air. Ethan stared into the flames, his reflection flickering. I've had trouble follow me before, he said finally. Doesn't scare me much anymore. Helen studied him, her expression softening. You're a soldier, aren't you? Was, he corrected. Navy. Recon unit. Then you understand the kind of people who run things like Project Sentinel. They don't like loose ends. For a long while, neither spoke. Ranger stirred, lifting his head weakly, his gaze moving between them. Ethan knelt beside him and ran a hand along his neck. Beneath the fur, he felt a rough ridge, a faint scar running in a perfect circle. Helen noticed it too. Collar burn, she said. Probably a shock device. They used those to enforce command compliance. You can tell by the depth of the mark. Ethan's hand froze. His voice came out low. They trained him with pain. Helen nodded. Over and over, until the dog stopped thinking and started obeying. Something in Ethan's eyes hardened. He had seen what breaking a living thing looked like. He'd seen it in men. He sat back, staring at Ranger. And in that moment, he knew. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was something deeper, darker. If what you're saying's true, he said, then he's proof. Proof someone buried the truth alive. Helen packed up her kit. Then keep him close, she warned, and keep your doors locked. If anyone knows he's still breathing, they'll want him back, or gone. As she left, the wind picked up outside, whistling through the thin gaps in the wooden walls. Ethan stood at the window, watching her SUV disappear into the fog. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Hard eyes, jaw clenched, the same expression he'd worn before going into combat. Behind him, Ranger gave a low whine. Ethan turned and knelt beside him again. They tried to break you, he said softly, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. But you're still here. That means something. The shepherd blinked, one ear flicking forward as if he understood. Ethan let out a slow breath, his voice steady. If they come for you, they'll have to go through me first. Outside, a raven cried in the distance, its echo cutting through the morning mist. Inside, the fire caught again, flaring just enough to light the room in gold and shadow. For the first time since finding Ranger, Ethan no longer felt like he'd saved a stray. He felt like he'd stepped into the middle of a story written long before he arrived. The night had settled heavy over Ravenfield, pressing down on the cabin like a thick wool blanket. The fire in the hearth had burned to dim orange coals, and the sound of wind scraping against the window panes came in slow, uneven sighs. Ethan sat at the table with a small lamp casting a pool of light over scattered notes. blood test results, and a frayed leather collar. Ranger lay beside the chair, chin resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert, the way soldiers sleep when they no longer trust the world to stay quiet. Ethan turned the collar over in his hand. The leather was cracked, stiff with dirt, but embedded in the inner lining was a thin, half-bent metal tag. When he rubbed it clean, faint numbers emerged. K947 Sen. The rest had been sheared away, as if someone had tried to erase the evidence with a blade. He frowned. Helen's words echoed in his head. Project Sentinel, erased records, dogs meant to vanish. He felt the weight of the tag between his fingers, small but damning. By morning, the fog had thickened, turning the forest into a blur of white trunks and gray air. Ethan drove into town, the road winding past the derelict sawmill and the row of boarded-up shops that once sold everything from tools to pies. The only place still alive was a cafe beside the old post office. Its neon sign flickered weakly, the word "open" half dead. He parked his truck and waited. He wasn't sure why, but he felt he wasn't alone in this story anymore. An hour later, a young man entered the cafe, thin, pale, wearing a worn black jacket and a press badge clipped to his collar. His hair was dark blonde and unkempt, his face sharp but tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He ordered nothing, just scanned the room until his gaze met Ethan's. Then he walked over. "You're Ethan Cole, right? Navy veteran?" His voice was low, quick, and edged with urgency. "Who's asking?" Ethan said evenly. "Daniel Reed. I'm an investigative journalist, and if I'm right, you've got something that used to belong to the government." Ethan studied him for a long second. "You talk too much for a man meeting a stranger." Daniel cracked a thin smile. "That's my curse, but you wouldn't have called me if you didn't want answers." They sat. Daniel pulled a small envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. "I've been tracking a story for 6 months. Illegal trade of military dogs. After Project Sentinel was shut down, hundreds of canines vanished from records, supposedly euthanized. But some didn't die. They were sold. Trained animals like this fetch good money in private security, even black ops contracts." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "You're saying they turned them into weapons for hire?" Daniel nodded. "And one of those dogs was yours, Ranger." He opened the envelope and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a fenced compound, men in uniform, rows of kennels. In the corner, barely visible, was a German shepherd with a torn ear and mismatched eyes. Ethan's throat went dry. "That's him." Daniel leaned forward. "This compound belongs to a woman named Catherine Moore. She runs a so-called rehabilitation center for aggressive dogs. In reality, it's a front for laundering animals discarded from military programs. I've got proof, surveillance footage, payment logs, even video of her taking bribes." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small USB drive wrapped in paper. "This has everything. I was going to publish it, but someone broke into my car 2 nights ago. They knew what I had. I've been hiding ever since." Before Ethan could speak, the cafe door opened. A man in his 50s entered, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded trucker jacket. His hair was silver, his face sunburned and lined, with a scar cutting across his left brow. He walked with a limp, favoring his right leg. The waitress greeted him softly. "Morning, Vic." He just nodded and ordered coffee. When his gaze swept the room, it lingered on Ethan and Daniel for a fraction too long before he turned away. Daniel noticed. "That's him," he whispered. "Victor Hale. Used to be Catherine's driver. If anyone knows the truth, it's him." Ethan stood, walked to the counter, and took the seat beside Victor. "You worked for Moore," he said quietly. Victor's spoon froze mid-stir. Depends who's asking. Ethan lowered his voice. The man who found the shepherd she tried to bury. The older man's shoulders tensed, but he didn't look up. After a moment, he muttered, "Then you should have left him where you found him." Ethan said nothing. Silence stretched between them until Victor exhaled heavily, the weight of memory in his breath. "You don't know what that woman's capable of," he said. "She's got friends in high places, lawyers, officers, men who'd sell their own for a paycheck. That dog, he wasn't supposed to live." Daniel approached, setting his recorder on the counter. "Tell us why." Victor's eyes flicked to the device. "Turn that off." Daniel hesitated, then clicked it off. "Fine. Just talk." Victor took a sip of coffee before speaking again. "I drove her and her lawyer, Blake Harrison, to a warehouse outside Mill Creek 3 months ago. They were arguing the whole way. Blake said the Shepherd incident needed to disappear before some investigation reached the state level. Catherine said she'd already handled it. When I asked what they meant, she laughed, said, 'We dumped the damn dog in the landfill. No one digs through garbage.'" Ethan's grip on the counter tightened. "You're sure of what you heard?" Victor nodded. "I've seen worse. I used to keep quiet, thought it wasn't my fight. But when I saw the news about dogs turning up dead with chips burned out, I knew it was time." He looked at Ethan now, his voice lowering. "If that dog's alive, you've got a target on your back, both of you." Ethan glanced at Daniel. "We need to copy that footage. Back it up somewhere safe." Daniel handed him the USB. "Already done. 2 copies. One stays with me." Ethan pocketed the drive. "Then we expose her." Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think the system wants to hear it? She's protected. The last guy who tried to blow the whistle ended up with his car in a ravine." Ethan's tone hardened. "Then we don't use the system. We use truth. One step at a time." He looked back at Victor. "You still have access to her routes?" The man hesitated. "Maybe. She still calls her old contacts when she needs drivers. But if she finds out I talked to you—" "She won't," Ethan said. "Not yet." Outside, the fog had started to lift, but the world didn't feel any clearer. The 3 men stood by the parking lot, the wind cutting through their jackets. Ranger, waiting in the truck, barked once, sharp and alert. Victor's eyes went to the dog. "He remembers," he said quietly. "You can see it in his eyes. They all did, right before they were taken away." Ethan placed a hand on the truck door. "Then we make sure this time he remembers freedom." As Daniel got into his car, he paused. "Ethan, whatever you do, be careful. People who know the truth about Project Sentinel don't live long enough to tell it." Ethan nodded. "I've already died once," he said. "Everything after is just borrowed time." He watched Daniel drive off into the mist, then turned to Victor, who lingered by his old truck. "You're coming back tomorrow," Ethan said. "We're not done." Victor's face was grim. "No, we're not." When Ethan finally returned to the cabin, Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of his boots. Ethan dropped the metal tag and the USB onto the table, side by side, the past and the proof. He knelt and met the shepherd's steady gaze. "They tried to bury you," he whispered. "Now we dig them up." The week that followed was a slow descent into noise. The kind of noise that didn't come from machines or storms, but from rumor. By Tuesday, every local paper in Ravenfield had Ethan's name printed in black ink, twisted beneath headlines that called him kidnapper, fraud, delusional veteran. The story spread fast. Decorated Navy veteran steals trained dog from private facility. Someone had leaked his old service photo, the one where his uniform looked too big for his shoulders, but his eyes carried the weight of war. They printed it beside a grainy image of Ranger, calling the shepherd stolen property. Ethan stopped reading after the first article. The ink didn't sting as much as the silence that followed it. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches now turned away. The man who ran the hardware store refused to look him in the eye. Even Maya, when she came by, looked pale with worry. "You have to fight back," she said softly. "They're dragging your name through the mud." Ethan just shook his head. "They want me angry," he said. "I won't give them that. We'll speak where it matters." The courthouse in Mill Creek was an old stone building that smelled of rain and paper. On the morning of the trial, the clouds hung low, pressing down like judgment itself. Ethan arrived early, wearing his only suit, a dark gray one that fit just well enough to hide the tremor in his hands. Ranger was not allowed inside, but he waited in the truck, watching through the window as if he knew the outcome mattered to both of them. Daniel was already there, pale from lack of sleep, clutching a folder full of documents. "They've stacked the deck," he muttered. "Blake filed fake witness statements, and Catherine brought half her staff to testify against you." Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll just tell the truth louder." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with reporters and cameras. Catherine Moore sat at the defense table, dressed in soft gray, her hair tied in a perfect bun, her expression demure, the picture of a misunderstood woman. Beside her sat Blake Harrison, her attorney, a man in his late 40s with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His suit was immaculate, his tie blood red, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who believed he owned the room. He had built his career defending the guilty and making them look like victims. Rumor said he once turned a fraud case into a charity plea. His eyes found Ethan across the aisle and curved into a smirk that said, "You've already lost." When the gavel struck, the air grew still. Judge Margaret Lane, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for fairness, presided with an unyielding calm. Her glasses glinted in the light as she looked over the papers. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "you may proceed." Blake rose smoothly. "Your Honor," he began, "my client, Mrs. Moore, is the rightful caretaker of the animal in question, a trained K-9 retired from service. Mr. Ethan Cole, exploiting his military background, forcibly removed the dog from her care, claiming false abuse to draw sympathy and attention. We intend to prove he orchestrated this for profit." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Blake continued, "We have witnesses who saw him trespass, and veterinary reports confirming the dog's prior ownership." He gestured toward the bench where 3 people sat. Actors in all but name, hired hands from Catherine's facility. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he rose, steady despite the storm. "I didn't steal a dog," he said. "I stopped a killing." His words were quiet, but cut through the room like clean steel. "That animal was left in a trash bag, beaten and drugged. I didn't take him. I saved him." Blake laughed softly, feigning pity. "Saved him? From a humane end? Mr. Cole's imagination seems to be his strongest witness." He turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man is not a hero. He's a soldier who can't stop fighting ghosts." Maya sat in the back row, her hands clasped tight, face pale. Helen was beside her, lips pressed into a thin line. They both knew the truth. But in court, truth often needed proof. For hours, Blake paraded doctored documents and fabricated testimonies, each more absurd than the last. One claiming Ranger was violent, another saying Ethan had forced entry. Every accusation was met with Ethan's silence. He refused to shout. He'd learned long ago that fury never convinced anyone. By midday, the tension was thick enough to touch. The judge called for a recess, but before anyone could move, the courtroom doors opened. Daniel stepped in, carrying a small, hard case. "Your Honor," he said, voice clear, "I have new evidence." Blake turned sharply. "Objection. This is irregular. Sit down, Mr. Harrison," the judge ordered. "Let's hear it." Daniel approached the bench and placed a USB drive in the clerk's hand. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared. Catherine Moore, seated at a table in a dim cafe, her posture relaxed. Across from her, a man slid an envelope across the table. Her voice came through, calm and cold. "Don't worry. I'll take care of the extras. No one checks dead dogs." She slipped the envelope into her purse and smiled. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector. Blake shot to his feet, face red. "This is fabricated," he barked. Daniel's voice stayed steady. "The video's time-stamped, verified by 3 sources, and includes your client's signature on the transfer documents." Before anyone could respond, Victor Hale entered through the side door, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was drawn, his hands trembling, but his eyes were clear. "Your Honor," he said, "I was there. I drove them to that cafe. I heard every word." He glanced toward Blake. "They wanted that shepherd gone because he had the wrong chip number, one that could lead straight back to Project Sentinel." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Harrison, any response?" Blake's mouth opened, but no sound came. Sweat glistened at his temples. Then, in a sudden burst of frustration, he slammed his hand on the table. "That damn dog should have disappeared from the start!" The words echoed through the chamber, hanging in the air like a confession. Cameras clicked. Catherine's face went white. The judge raised her gavel. "That will be enough." Silence. Ethan sat still, his heartbeat heavy in his ears. For the first time, Ranger, waiting just beyond the door with a court officer, let out a low bark, one sharp note that cut through the hush. It was as if the sound itself sealed the truth. The judge turned to the defense. "Given the evidence and the admission just made, the court will recess to deliberate. But I will say this: sometimes the silent witness speaks loudest of all." When the gavel struck again, Ethan looked toward Daniel and Victor, both exhausted but standing tall. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted, reporters shouting, flashes bursting like gunfire. But he barely heard them. He only heard the echo of Ranger's bark, that single sound that carried everything words could not. Morning came with the kind of brightness that only follows a storm. The courthouse steps glistened from the night's rain, each drop catching the sunlight like pieces of shattered glass. The town square was already filling with reporters, the click of cameras mingling with murmurs of curiosity. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the air around him shift. Not with dread, but with something quieter, almost sacred. Inside the courtroom, Judge Margaret Lane took her seat with the same calm poise that had steadied the chaos in every previous session. Her gray hair was pinned neatly, her face unreadable. She glanced over the packed room before lifting the gavel. Court is now in session. Catherine Moore sat at the defendant's table, no longer polished or composed. The mask had cracked. Her once sleek bun had loosened into uneven strands, her pale foundation unable to hide the sleeplessness beneath her eyes. Her gray suit hung on her like armor that no longer fit. Next to her, Blake Harrison looked worse. His tie gone, his collar undone, the once confident glint in his eyes dulled by exhaustion and humiliation. His right hand twitched occasionally, a nervous habit of a man watching his empire collapse. Around them sat a few of their former allies, silent now, their faces turned away. The courtroom fell into stillness as Judge Lane began to read the verdict. After reviewing all evidence, testimonies, and presented exhibits, this court finds Mrs. Catherine Moore guilty on charges of animal cruelty, fraud, and evidence tampering. A ripple of reaction swept through the crowd. Cameras flashed like lightning. Catherine's lips trembled, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. The judge continued, her voice firm but not cruel. Furthermore, Mr. Blake Harrison is found guilty of obstruction of justice and perjury. Effective immediately, his license to practice law is revoked pending federal review. Blake slumped in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to disappear into it. Ethan sat motionless, his hands folded together, feeling the weight of months lift from his chest. It wasn't triumph. It was release. His gaze drifted to the back of the courtroom, where Maya and Helen stood together, their eyes glassy with relief. Daniel was beside them, still clutching his notepad, though he hadn't written a word in an hour. Victor sat alone in the corner, hat in hand, his expression one of quiet redemption. When the gavel struck for the final time, the sound echoed like a bell announcing not victory, but closure. The dog known as Ranger, the judge concluded, is hereby placed under the legal guardianship of Mr. Ethan Cole, effective immediately. This court acknowledges his actions as an act of rescue, not theft. She paused, her tone softening. Sometimes mercy demands defiance. Court is adjourned. As the crowd began to stir, Catherine suddenly rose. Her voice broke through the room like a splinter. "You can't take everything from me!" she cried, her tone cracked, desperate. Two bailiffs moved in, firm but respectful, guiding her away. For a fleeting moment, her eyes locked on Ethan's, filled not with hatred but disbelief, as if she still couldn't understand how the world had turned without her permission. Then she was gone. Blake followed, silent, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him. The door shut behind them, and with it, the long echo of corruption ended. Outside, the sun had burned through the clouds. Ethan stepped down the courthouse stairs slowly, the murmur of voices fading into the background. Maya was waiting near the bottom, her auburn hair catching the light, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. She wore a dark blue coat, its hem fluttering in the wind. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling but sure. Ethan nodded. "It's over." But even as he said it, he knew the kind of pain that leaves scars never really ends. It just softens. He turned as Ranger trotted forward, led gently by one of the court officers. The German shepherd's fur gleamed in the sunlight now. The once dull patches healed into a thick, healthy coat of gold and sable. His torn ear stood half up, half folded, like a flag of both defiance and survival. Ethan knelt down, resting his calloused hand on the dog's head. "It's done, Ranger," he whispered. "You're free now." The shepherd lifted his gaze, those deep amber eyes reflecting both the sun and something older. Trust reborn from ruin. His tail moved once, then again, slow and steady. Maya wiped her eyes, smiling through the tears. "He understands you." Ethan gave a faint, crooked smile. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He always did." Around them the crowd thinned, reporters packing up their equipment, the chaos dissolving into the ordinary rhythm of life. Daniel approached, camera in hand. "You don't want to make a statement?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. The truth already spoke. Daniel nodded, respecting the silence, and walked away toward the parking lot, already half lost in thought about the story that had just rewritten itself. Victor lingered for a moment, standing near his old pickup. The wind tugged at his jacket, the lines in his face deepened by sunlight. He raised a hand in farewell. "Take care of that one," he said. "He's got more heart than most men I've met." Ethan nodded. "So do you, Vic." The old driver smiled faintly and climbed into his truck, disappearing down the road toward whatever peace he could still find. As the courthouse emptied, the last of the reporters drifted away, leaving the steps quiet again. Ethan stood beside Maya, watching the flags flutter above the entrance. For the first time in years, he felt the world breathe without resistance. The ache in his chest wasn't gone, but it was bearable, transformed into something that almost felt like gratitude. Maya reached out, slipping, her hand into his. "What now?" she asked softly. Ethan looked down at Ranger, who was sitting alert, ears pricked towards the open street. "We go home," he said. They began to walk, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon light. Around them, the townsfolk who had once whispered now simply watched in silence, not out of pity, but out of respect. Ranger moved between them, stride steady, head held high. The wind brushed through his fur, carrying the scent of rain and freedom. Ethan looked at him and smiled. "You did good, partner." The shepherd gave a short, contented huff in reply. By the time they reached the edge of the square, the courthouse bell rang behind them. 3 slow chimes that rolled across the valley. Ethan stopped for a moment and turned back, taking it in. The building, the sky, the sound of a world still turning. He knelt one last time beside Ranger, resting his hand against the dog's neck. "No medals," he murmured. "No speeches, just peace." Ranger's eyes glimmered, golden and calm, as if agreeing that peace was enough. Together they walked on. 2 survivors, bound not by blood or command, but by mercy that had finally found its voice. The seasons turned softly in Ravenfield. Winter's bite eased into the gentler breath of spring, and the town that once whispered suspicion now greeted Ethan Cole with nods and quiet respect. The courthouse that had once held the weight of judgment now stood like an old ghost behind him, fading into memory. Ethan's cabin, once a place of isolation, had changed too. Its porch was painted anew, the walls patched, and the garden in front now held small wooden planters that Maya had built herself. Lavender, wild daisies, and rows of mint that filled the air with a calm sweetness. The old war veteran had traded drills and orders for soil and sunlight. Yet the rhythm of his life didn't truly shift until the idea of gentle warriors was born. It started one morning when Maya came by with a handful of letters. She looked radiant under the pale gold light, her auburn hair tied loosely, strands framing her kind face, her brown eyes steady with thought. "They came from the school," she said, setting the letters on the table. "The kids saw the news about you and Ranger. Their teacher asked if you'd come talk to them." Ethan blinked. "About what? Trials and stray dogs?" She smiled faintly. "About courage, about kindness." He hesitated. "I'm not much for speeches." "Then don't make one," Maya said softly. "Just bring Ranger." 2 days later, they stood in the small gymnasium of Maplewood Elementary. The place smelled of chalk and floor wax, and the laughter of children echoed like wind through tall grass. Ranger walked beside Ethan, tail wagging gently, his once rough coat now gleaming with health. The kids gathered in a half circle, their faces wide with awe. Among them was a boy named Jamie, perhaps 10, with sandy hair and glasses too big for his nose. He whispered, "Is he real?" Ethan chuckled. "Very real. His name's Ranger." The boy reached out a hesitant hand, and Ranger, ever patient, leaned forward to let him touch the soft fur on his neck. When Jamie's fingers brushed the scar beneath the dog's collar, he paused. "What happened?" he asked. Ethan knelt down beside him, his voice low. "Someone hurt him once, but he learned to trust again. That's his real strength." That afternoon, as they walked back home, Maya said, "You could do this more often. You have a gift with those kids." Ethan smiled faintly. "No, Ranger does." And so it began. The Gentle Warriors program, a small initiative run from their cabin and the old community hall near the lake. It started with a handful of children, then more came. Kids from broken homes, shy ones who spoke little, restless ones who didn't know where to place their anger. Maya handled the organization with quiet precision. She was good with people, good with details. She had a warmth that drew even the most withdrawn children out of their shells. Ethan handled the teaching, basic obedience lessons, the meaning of patience, and what loyalty really looked like. But Ranger was the heart of it all. The shepherd, now fully recovered, had grown into his quiet role as the teacher's companion. He would sit among the children as they read stories about rescue and courage, his golden eyes calm, his breathing steady. Sometimes he'd rest his head in a child's lap, and when small hands ran over the old scars along his back, the room would fall silent. No one spoke of pain, yet everyone understood it. Those scars had become symbols of endurance, of survival, of the kind of forgiveness that humans so often forget. The children adored him. They'd draw his face on paper, clumsy but full of love, or tie ribbons around his neck during festivals. Once, Jamie, the boy with the oversized glasses, brought him a hand-painted tag that read, "Hero." Ranger wore it proudly. Ethan often sat by the fence, watching them. The laughter, the energy, the small acts of kindness that rippled outward from a dog who had once been thrown away. It felt strange, he thought, how redemption rarely came with grand speeches or medals, but with quiet afternoons like this. Maya would join him, sitting close, her hand finding his, as naturally as sunlight finding a window. "You're different now," she once said. "Quieter, maybe even happy." He smiled, eyes on Ranger. "Maybe because, for once, I'm not fighting something. I'm building something." As spring rolled into early summer, the program flourished. Local shelters began sending rescue animals for rehabilitation and adoption. Volunteers joined, teachers, retired vets, and young people eager to learn. Helen, Maya's sister, became the official vet for the initiative, visiting once a week in her faded denim jacket, her face softer now than the day she'd first warned Ethan about the dangers of keeping Ranger. "He's the healthiest trauma case I've ever seen," she said one morning, scratching the shepherd behind his ear. "Looks like he decided to live after all." Ethan smiled. "Didn't we all?" One evening, long after the children had gone home and the last echo of laughter had faded across the field, Ethan sat on the porch with Ranger lying at his feet. The air was thick with the scent of pine and cut grass, and the sky burned with the slow fire of sunset. Maya was inside, humming softly as she cleaned up after dinner. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hands folded loosely over his chest. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching at some distant sound, then relaxed again. The old soldier looked down at his companion, at the faint silver around the dog's muzzle, at the calm intelligence in his eyes. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "I used to think strength was about pulling a trigger, about standing between danger and the people you love." He reached down, brushing his hand across Ranger's fur. "But you—" He smiled, the kind that carried gratitude instead of pride. "You taught me it's about standing between the past and who you want to be." Ranger blinked slowly, his tail thumping once against the porch. The firelight from inside spilled through the window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. The wind carried the faint sound of children laughing from a distance, the echoes of tomorrow already forming. As night settled, Maya stepped onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She looked at Ethan and Ranger, her smile soft and full. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "It is." For a while, none of them spoke. The world had quieted in a way that felt earned. The porch light flickered, the crickets began their song, and somewhere deep in the woods, an owl called, a reminder that life kept moving, gentle and unafraid. Ethan looked at the shepherd once more, the firelight reflected in his eyes. "I used to carry a gun to protect the world," he whispered. "But you showed me how to protect what's left of my faith." Ranger gave a soft exhale, almost like a sigh of agreement. And in that small, tender silence, beneath the hum of the night and the warmth of home, they sat together. Two gentle warriors, not of battle, but of mercy. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, on four legs with a scarred back and eyes that still believe in goodness. Ranger wasn't just a dog rescued from darkness. He was proof that grace still walks among us, that God's mercy can take the shape of a wagging tail and a second chance. Ethan once thought war had taken all faith from him, but through one broken creature, he found the kind of love that doesn't shout, only endures. That's how God works, isn't it? Not always through the mighty, but through the meek, through the ones who keep showing up, who keep loving, who keep forgiving when the world tells them not to. So if you believe that compassion still changes lives, if you believe that every small act of kindness is a spark of the divine, then share this story. Leave a comment about someone or something that reminded you of God's grace. And don't forget to subscribe, so together we can spread these stories of faith, mercy, and hope to the world. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and remind you, even in the darkest corners of life, His miracles are still happening, every single day.